They chose moonrise for a reason. Not dawn, when mercy still lingered in pale light. Not midnight, when fear was sharp enough to fracture resolve. They waited until the moon climbed just above the frost-crusted towers of Frostreach Keep, its light bleeding red through a veil of thin clouds, staining the snow like something wounded. It was the hour when wolves were said to remember their instincts, when the forest listened more closely than usual. That was when they brought Mira into the courtyard. She walked between two silent guards, her boots sliding across ice-slick stone, her breath tearing out of her in short, uneven bursts. The cold had already worked its way through the thin shawl around her shoulders, and the pack had not even spoken yet. The torches lining the yard bent in the wind like frightened things, their flames guttering low, as if they wanted nothing to do with what was about to happen. The entire pack had gathered, though no one had announced it. Warriors leaned against the walls with arms crossed, pretending indifference. Omegas huddled near the stairwell, cloaks pulled tight, eyes wide with something dangerously close to recognition. Elders sat on the raised stone platform beneath the great frost-carved emblem of Frostreach, staffs resting across their knees, mouths set in the familiar line of authority that rarely softened. At the center of it all stood the Alpha Lord. His cloak was heavy with wolf fur, the silver clasp at his throat shaped like the crest of their line, a running wolf framed by a crescent moon. He looked every bit the ruler the stories celebrated, tall, broad-shouldered, unmoved by the cold that gnawed at everyone else. When he spoke, his voice carried without effort, cutting cleanly through the howl of the wind. "Mira of Frostreach," he said. Her name sounded strange in his mouth, like it did not belong to her anymore. She lifted her chin because she had been taught that Omegas were not supposed to shrink, even when they were afraid. Her knees trembled anyway. "You have been given time," the Alpha continued. "More time than most in your position. You were raised among us. You were sheltered. You were taught our ways." She nodded faintly. The memories pressed in on her, uninvited, chasing pups through summer fields, patching torn training gear while listening to warriors brag about victories she would never taste, curling in the healer's den to hold the paws of injured scouts when no one else had the patience. "I have done what I could," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded in the open air. "You have done nothing of what was required," one of the elders snapped. "You do not shift, you do not form bonds, you remain incomplete." The word struck harder than a blow. Incomplete. Not broken, not wrong. Just unfinished, as if she were a failed attempt at something better. Mira swallowed, her throat burned. "I tried," she whispered. "I waited for the change, I waited for the call, Waiting is not strength," the Alpha interrupted. His eyes were pale gold in the torchlight, flat and unreadable. "Winter does not pause for hesitation." A murmur moved through the gathered wolves. Some faces tightened. Some turned away. A few wore expressions of relief, the kind people wore when judgment fell on someone else instead of them. The moon slid higher between the towers, its red light pooling on the stones at Mira's feet. She felt suddenly as though she were standing in blood. "You will be escorted to the gates," the Alpha said. "You will leave our territory before the moon reaches its peak." The guards stepped forward, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of their bodies, heat she would soon lose. Mira's chest tightened painfully. She had imagined many ways this might happen in her darker moments. Whispered exile, quiet disappearance, being sent away under the pretense of safety. Not this. Not with witnesses. Not with the moon watching like a silent judge. "If I go out there now," she said, and could not keep the tremor from her words, "I won't make it to morning." The Alpha leaned closer, his voice dropped, carrying only to her. "That is not our concern." Something in her broke then, not loudly, not visibly, but in the deep place where hope had been storing itself in small, foolish increments for years. The part of her that had believed someone might step forward at the last second, that someone might say, "She is ours. She is worth something." No one moved. The iron gates began to open behind her, screaming in protest as they dragged against frost. The blizzard rushed in like a living thing, snow pelting her cheeks, her lashes, her mouth. The torches sputtered and bent, fighting to stay lit. Mira turned once more toward the crowd. No one met her eyes. She stepped forward into the storm. The gates slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her bones. The sound was muffled by wind and snow, but the meaning was unmistakable. She was no longer Frostreach. The forest swallowed her almost immediately. The path beyond the gates vanished beneath drifts. The trees loomed like dark ribs, bending and groaning under the weight of winter. Snow clogged her boots, soaked through her shawl, found its way down the collar of her dress until she could no longer tell where the cold ended and she began. She walked until her legs would not obey her anymore. When she fell, the blizzard barely noticed. She pressed her hands into the snow, trying to push herself up, but her arms shook violently, refusing the command. Tears froze on her lashes. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned more than the cold ever could. "I wasn't weak," she whispered to the storm. "I was just quiet." Something shifted in the darkness. At first she thought it was the wind, or the way exhaustion made shapes out of nothing. Then she saw the eyes, steady, luminous, watching her through the swirling white. One pair, then another's, then more. They did not rush her. They did not bare their teeth. They simply stood at the edge of the blizzard, dark shapes against darker trees, their attention fixed on the girl Frostreach had just thrown away. And as Mira lay there in the snow with Moonrise bleeding across the forest floor, the wolves did something her pack never had. They stayed. The storm was not angry. It was indifferent. That was the cruelest thing about it, the way the blizzard tore through the forest without malice, without purpose, swallowing Mira's sobs as easily as it swallowed her footprints. The wind did not know she had been cast out. The snow did not care that she had nowhere else to go. Winter was not a punishment. It was simply there. Mira lay on her side where she had fallen, cheek pressed against ice so cold it burned. Her fingers curled weakly, scraping uselessly at the drifts as if she could pull warmth out of the ground. Her body shuddered, each tremor smaller than the last, exhaustion tightening its grip with frightening speed. The wolves had not moved closer. They watched from the shadows, shapes barely visible through the thick curtain of falling snow. Their eyes glowed steadily, not the wild glare of hunger, but something quieter, older, recognition. Mira tried to lift her head. She couldn't. The storm roared in her ears, loud enough to drown out the soft, shuffling steps that finally broke the distance. She only felt it, the change in the air, the way the wind no longer clawed directly at her back. A massive shape settled beside her. Warmth brushed her arm. Mira flinched weakly, bracing for teeth, for claws, for the swift, efficient end that she had been taught to expect from wolves who were not her pack. Nothing happened. Instead, something heavy pressed gently against her spine, shielding her from the worst of the storm. Another presence followed, then another, each one blocking a different angle of the blizzard until the violence of the wind dulled into a muted howl beyond a living wall of fur. Mira's lips parted in disbelief. She forced her eyes open. A wolf lay beside her, so close she could see individual snowflakes melting into its dark coat. Its eyes were silver-flecked and steady, fixed on her face as though waiting for permission to exist this near her. Its breath fogged the air between them, warm and rhythmic. "Why?" she whispered. The wolf did not answer. It shifted its weight, curling inward just enough that its body cupped hers, creating a hollow in the snow where warmth could gather. The sensation was so sudden and so foreign that Mira gasped, pain flaring as numb flesh began to thaw. She bit back a cry. Another wolf approached from the other side, lowering itself with careful precision across her legs. Its bulk pinned her lightly to the ground, not in restraint, but in protection, anchoring her so the storm could not pull her farther into the drifts. The forest around them filled with breath. 10 wolves settled into place, one by one, until Mira lay at the center of a ring of heat and heartbeat, their bodies overlapping just enough to trap warmth and shut the wind out of her world. She had never been surrounded like this. Not by her pack. Not by anyone. Her tears soaked into thick fur as the cold retreated inch by agonizing inch. Her fingers twitched, then flexed, sensation screaming back into them with pins and needles' intensity. She welcomed the pain. It meant she was still here. "You don't even know me," she murmured, voice breaking. "They said I was nothing." The nearest wolf exhaled slowly, its breath fogging her cheek in a soft cloud. Its tail thumped once in the snow, a quiet, deliberate sound that felt impossibly loud in the muffled world inside their circle. Mira closed her eyes. For the first time since the gates had slammed behind her, The storm felt far away. Mira did not expect to wake. She had fallen asleep with the storm in her ears and frost in her lungs, convinced the darkness would finish what the night had begun. So when consciousness crept back in gentle waves rather than pain, she thought for a long, disoriented moment that she was dreaming. There was no wind screaming through her skull, no ice cutting her skin. There was only warmth. Not the thin warmth of a dying fire, but something layered and living, pressing in from all sides like the slow, steady rhythm of breath in a room full of sleepers. Mira stirred weakly, her lashes fluttering against cheeks that no longer burned. Her hand brushed fur. She froze. Memory snapped into place, the courtyard, the moon, the gates slamming shut behind her. The wolves. Her eyes opened. She lay at the center of a circle of bodies, dark fur catching the pale blue light of early morning. Snow drifted lazily between branches overhead, but none of it touched her. The wolves had formed a living canopy, their shapes overlapping just enough to keep the cold at bay. The storm was gone. The forest stood in stunned, fragile quiet, as if the world itself were unsure whether to speak. Mira pushed herself upright slowly, half expecting teeth, growls, some reminder that she had crossed into a space where she did not belong. The wolves adjusted instantly. One shifted closer to brace her back. Another moved its head beneath her elbow so she could lean without falling. Their movements were precise and gentle, their attention fixed not on dominance, but on her stability. "I'm still alive," she whispered. The silver-flecked wolf closest to her lifted its head. Their eyes met. She had been afraid of wolf eyes her entire life, of the way they glowed in the dark, of the instinct that coiled behind them like a weapon. But this gaze held no hunger, no challenge. Only awareness. "You stayed," she said, and the words broke something open in her chest. The wolf's ears flicked almost shyly. Another wolf pressed closer at her side, its warmth seeping through her cloak until Mira had to clench her teeth to keep from crying out. The pain of thawing flesh was sharp, but it was a pain she welcomed. It meant she had not been abandoned here to become part of the snow. She lifted her trembling hand, pausing inches from the silver-flecked wolf's fur. If it snapped, she would not be able to pull away. She touched it anyway. The wolf did not flinch. Her fingers sank into thick warmth, into a living thing that had chosen her without being asked. The sensation flooded her senses, texture, heat, heartbeat, grounding her more effectively than any order she had ever obeyed. A soft sound escaped her throat. It was not quite a sob. It was not quite a laugh. "I thought I was meant to disappear," she whispered. "That was what they taught me, that quiet wolves don't survive." The wolves said nothing. They did not need to. They tightened their circle by a fraction, not confining her but confirming her place at its center. Mira felt something stir beneath her skin, a faint warmth pulsing at her wrist, then her chest, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to her alone. She pressed her palm against it in startled disbelief. Images flashed behind her eyes, moonlit glades. Wolves lowering their heads not in submission but in recognition. Storms bending around a single still figure standing unarmed at the forest's heart. Not a ruler. A center. Mira's breath caught painfully. "You won't let me go," she said, not as a question but as a realization. The silver-flecked wolf leaned forward and rested its forehead lightly against her knee. It was the gentlest of refusals. Frostreach woke under a sky that did not belong to it. The storm had torn through the valley all night, yet when dawn finally reached the towers, it did not arrive with the usual brittle clarity of winter mornings. Instead, the air lay thick and muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Snow coated every ledge and parapet in soft, treacherous drifts, but the unease rippling through the pack had nothing to do with cold. Hunters were the first to notice. They left the gates before the light fully claimed the sky, following the same routes their paws had memorized since youth. Yet barely a quarter-mile into the Frostwood, the land began to speak in ways that unsettled them. Tracks crossed their path, not scattered, not chaotic, but layered with deliberate repetition, wide arcs that did not lead toward prey or border markers. The prints circled something. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Wolves did not guard empty snow. They turned back before instinct overruled caution. By the time they returned to the keep, the pack was already stirring. The blizzard had left behind not only drifts but questions, and questions traveled faster through Frostreach than any howl. "There are wolves in the Frostwood," one scout reported to the council, snow still clinging to his cloak. His eyes flicked to the high windows as though expecting the forest to be watching him through stone. "They're not ours. They're not pressing our borders. They're holding position." A low murmur moved through the chamber. "How many?" someone asked. "At least 10, the scout replied. "But I have the sense there are more farther back. We didn't go close enough to count." Arden Frostmark listened without expression. The Alpha Lord sat in the high-backed stone chair carved with the sigil of his line, hands resting lightly on the armrests as though he were listening to a routine patrol report rather than something that unsettled every instinct in the room. 10 wolves did not frighten Frostreach. 10 wolves choosing not to dominate, not to provoke, not to flee. That was something else entirely. "They are not hunting?" Arden asked. "No, my lord," the scout said. "They're circling something, guarding it." The word echoed faintly in the chamber. "Guarding?" Arden dismissed the council with a sharp nod. The elders rose reluctantly, murmuring among themselves, but he had already turned away. The restlessness under his skin was growing louder, gnawing at the edges of the authority he wore like armor. He descended into the lower vaults alone. The spiral stair that led beneath Frostreach had not been used in years except by archivists, and those too nostalgic to accept that old stories were little more than carvings on forgotten walls. Frost glazed the stone here more thickly than above, sealing the air in a quiet that pressed in on the ears. Arden walked until the torchlight thinned, until the walls around him began to speak. Carvings covered the stone, not the triumphs of Ironpine and Frostreach that adorned the upper halls, but older shapes, older beliefs, circles of wolves, figures without crowns, symbols of storm and moon etched together as if they had never been meant to be separate. He stopped before one half-erased mural. Time had worn the details nearly smooth, but the composition remained unmistakable. Wolves forming a ring, their heads inclined toward a single unarmed figure at the center. Not a king, not a conqueror. An anchor. Arden brushed snowdust from the stone with gloved fingers, breath fogging in the stale air. Beneath the image, fractured runes clung stubbornly to the rock. He traced them silently, the old words coming back to him with unsettling clarity. When the pack casts her into the storm, the forest will not. When the moon witnesses exile, the dawn will answer with teeth and silence. When she is forgotten, she will be crowned where no throne stands. Arden closed his eyes. Mira's face rose unbidden in his mind, not the version that stood small and trembling beneath the moon, but the girl he had known once, before expectation had eroded her into quiet obedience. The one who had stayed behind to clean training yards after the others left. The one who had held injured scouts through fever when even healers grew weary. The one he had sent into the storm without looking back. A shudder passed through him that had nothing to do with cold. Above him, faint howls carried through layers of stone, not the sharp territorial cry of challengers, not the rallying call of war, but something woven and deep, as though many throats were shaping a single voice. The forest was speaking, and for the first time since he had taken the Alpha's seat, Arden felt it was no longer speaking to him. Arden Frostmark did not summon the guard. He did not call the council back into session, nor did he ask the elders to follow him with their carved staffs and whispered warnings. Whatever waited in the Frostwood was not meant to be met by ceremony or authority. It required something far rarer in Frostreach than obedience. It required honesty. He left the keep through the narrow eastern gate that opened directly into the trees, the stone archway half buried by the blizzard's remains. The guards straightened instinctively as he passed, their surprise hidden poorly behind rigid postures. The Alpha rarely walked alone beyond the walls, not since the border wars, not since the night his mate had died under the same moon that had watched Mira's exile. The forest closed around him almost immediately. Sound changed first. The hollow echo of Frostreach stone gave way to muffled hush, as though snow and pine needles were swallowing the world one breath at a time. Then the scent, not the sharp iron of the keep, but resin, frost, and the faint animal warmth that lingered even in winter's grip. Arden followed the scouts, reports deeper into the Frostwood, past boundary stones etched with sigils few remembered how to read. Snow clung thick to the lower branches, bending them into arches that forced him to duck and weave like a novice hunter. The tracks were everywhere now, not a single trail but many, overlapping, circling, as if the wolves who made them had not wished to move forward or back. They had wished to stay. The realization unsettled him more than any hostile incursion could have. He was still 100 paces from the abandoned barn when the forest grew silent. Not empty. Attentive. Arden slowed instinctively, his hand brushing the hilt of the blade he wore more out of habit than expectation of use. His wolf stirred beneath his skin, hackles lifting not in aggression, but in the disquiet that came when an unspoken law was being rewritten. 10 shapes emerged from between the trees. They did not rush him. They did not bare their teeth or lower their heads in challenge. They stepped forward in deliberate unison, arranging themselves in a loose arc across the narrow glade, their bodies forming a living threshold. Arden stopped. "You trespass on Frostreach land," he said, voice carrying without effort. The wolves did not answer. The largest among them, a dark-coated beast with silver streaks dusting its shoulders, took a single step forward. It did not snarl. It looked at him, not as prey, not as rival, as something being weighed. "What do you guard?" Arden asked quietly. The wolf's ears flicked. Behind them, deeper in the Frostwood, he felt it, a presence that was not hostile, not afraid, but profoundly anchored. It tugged faintly at the same place in his chest where his bond to the pack should have lived. Memory struck like ice. Mira standing beneath the moon, snow collecting in her hair as she refused to look down even when he spoke her sentence. "I was wrong," Arden murmured, though he did not yet know what he meant by it. He took a step forward. The wolves shifted instantly, closing the space he had aimed for with silent precision. This was not a blockade. It was a boundary. Arden exhaled slowly, the truth settling into him with the inexorable weight of winter. Whatever lay beyond this living wall had been claimed, not by dominance, not by force, but by something the forest itself recognized. He straightened. "I will not fight you," he said. The silver-streaked wolf tilted its head. And in that quiet, wordless exchange, Arden Frostmark understood something that kings were rarely taught to see. Authority did not always belong to the one who spoke the loudest. The forest did not breathe until she did. Arden stood before the living wall of wolves, the cold leaching steadily through the seams of his boots, but it was not winter that rooted him in place. It was the certainty, deep and unyielding, that something had shifted beyond his authority, beyond his reach. Snow drifted lazily from the high boughs, settling on dark fur and melting without sound. The wolves held their formation with unnerving calm, their eyes fixed not on him, but on a place behind them where the frostwood thickened around the sagging frame of the abandoned barn. The door creaked. The sound was faint, nearly lost to the hush of morning, yet every wolf responded as if the forest itself had spoken. Shoulders eased, ears turned. The rigid arc softened into something that resembled expectation. Then Mira stepped into the light. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her cloak hung loosely from her shoulders, hay clinging to its hem, and snow glimmered faintly in her dark hair where the storm had not yet relinquished its claim. Yet she moved with a stillness Arden had never seen in her before, not the timid carefulness he had mistaken for weakness, but the quiet certainty of something that had learned where it belonged. The wolves parted. Not abruptly, not in deference. They shifted just enough to create a path, their bodies angling away from her with instinctive precision, a corridor of fur and breath opening where moments ago there had been none. Arden's breath caught painfully in his chest. "Mira," he said. Her name fell between them like an old truth neither of them had known how to hold. She stopped a few paces behind the wolves, her gaze lifting to meet his. There was no fear in her eyes, no flinch, no reflexive shrinking, only a depth of awareness that made the forest seem smaller for containing it. "You came," she said. It was not a question. "I had to," Arden replied, and in the saying of it felt the first crack in the armor he had worn for too long. The wolves leaned subtly toward her, not touching, not crowding, but arranging themselves with her presence as their axis. The snow between them bore no sign of struggle, only the quiet imprint of a path the forest had chosen. "What is happening here?" Arden asked, though some part of him already knew the answer would not comfort him. Mira hesitated. Then she stepped forward. The wolves parted wider, the living corridor opening without sound or command, as if her intention alone were enough to redraw the world. She stopped within arm's reach of him, the faint scent of pine and fur clinging to her clothes. "They heard me," she said quietly. "Who?" Arden demanded. "The forest," she replied, "and the wolves who still listened to it." Warmth stirred beneath her sleeve, so subtle it might have been imagined, yet Arden saw it, a whisper of gold beneath pale skin, pulsing like a second heartbeat. His own wolf whimpered softly within him, unsettled not by threat, but by recognition it had never been taught to voice. "You were sent into the storm," Arden said, his voice breaking before he could stop it. "You should have been." "Gone," Mira finished. The word was not bitter. It was clear. She lifted her arm slightly, just enough for the light beneath her sleeve to brighten, not in spectacle, but in steady illumination that seemed to cut through more than snow. "You told me I was incomplete," she said, "that I failed the pack." Arden opened his mouth to deny it, to reach for a justification that had once felt sufficient. Nothing came. "I thought weakness was loud," Mira continued. "I thought strength was something you had to shout into the world until it listened, but the forest showed me something different." The wolves shifted again, forming not a barrier but a shape, a curved gathering that placed her at its center without enclosing her. "I was never meant to lead by force," she said. "I was meant to stand still enough that others could find their way back to themselves." Arden bowed his head before he realized what he was doing. Arden did not remember deciding to kneel. One moment he stood facing the girl he had exiled into a blizzard, trying to reconcile the Mira he had dismissed as fragile with the stillness that now seemed to bend the forest toward her. The next, his knees sank into the snow as if the land itself had drawn him down, pulling authority out of his bones until he could no longer pretend it belonged to him. The wolves reacted instantly. They did not snarl, nor did they surge forward in defense. Instead, they rearranged themselves with unnerving precision, widening their loose formation into a perfect ring around Mira, not to cage her, but to crown her with living breath and fur. Their movements were so fluid that Arden had the irrational sense he was watching a ritual rehearsed across centuries rather than a moment unfolding in real time. The silver-streaked wolf approached first. Its massive paws made no sound as it stepped across the snow, its head lowering slowly until its brow brushed the frozen ground at Mira's feet. The act was not submission. It was acknowledgement stripped of ceremony, the way storms bowed to mountains they could not move. Mira inhaled sharply. Her hands, which had trembled so often in Frostreach's halls, stilled at her sides as if some deeper instinct had finally found its place. She did not step back from the wolf, nor did she reach for it. She simply stood, letting the quiet weight of the moment settle through her bones. One by one, the other wolves followed. Dark heads dipped in unison. Breath fogged the cold air in layered clouds that rose and fell like a single organism learning how to breathe together. The forest beyond them seemed to lean closer, branches creaking softly beneath snow, as if drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with weather. Arden's throat closed. He had seen packs kneel before kings. He had watched rival alphas submit after battles that cost too much blood. None of it felt like this. There was no violence in the wolves bowing, no fear driving their stillness. There was only recognition. "I told myself I was protecting them," Arden said, the words tearing out of him before he could temper them. His voice sounded wrong in the open glade, too sharp, too human for a moment that did not care about titles. "I said you weakened Frostreach. I said the pack would crumble if it learned to carry those who could not fight." Mira turned her gaze to him. He expected anger. He braced for it like a blow. What he found instead was clarity. "I didn't know how to be loud," she said softly. "That was my only crime." The words were not accusation, they were fact. Arden bowed his head, pressing his gloved hands into the snow as if grounding himself in something solid might keep him from dissolving into the truth of what he had done. Memory flooded him, Mira sitting alone after training sessions, stitching torn cloaks no one bothered to thank her for. Mira holding feverish pups through the night while warriors slept. Mira watching battles from the walls, eyes bright not with envy but with longing to matter. "You never asked to lead," he said hoarsely. Myra's sleeve slipped back a fraction. Golden light breathed through her skin, not flaring, not demanding attention, but glowing with the same quiet certainty that had drawn the wolves to her in the first place. It was not a mark of dominance. It was a signal, a frequency that resonated with something the forest had been waiting to answer. "They told me I was incomplete," she whispered. "But maybe I was only unfinished, waiting for a place that didn't need me to shout to be heard." The wolves shifted again, tightening their ring just enough to make the boundary of their refusal unmistakable. They were not letting her go. Not back into halls that had taught her to shrink, not into a system that had mistaken endurance for weakness. They were holding her in the center of a truth Frostreach had forgotten how to recognize. Arden straightened slowly, snow clinging to his knees, his breath coming in uneven bursts. He did not rise. He could not. For the first time since he had taken the Alpha's seat, he understood that leadership was not something seized. It was something allowed, something granted by those who still listened when the world grew too loud. "You were never meant to disappear," he said. "You were meant to remain." Mira closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat the forest was utterly still. Then deep in the Frostwood, a low sound rose, not a howl, not a challenge, but a layered murmur that moved through the wolves like a shared pulse. They leaned closer to her without touching, sealing the circle of warmth and breath that no blizzard could break. They had claimed her not as queen, but as center, and they would not let the dawn take her from them. Dawn did not arrive the way it always had in Frostreach. There was no trumpet of sunlight splitting the sky, no sharp white blaze across frozen stone. Instead, the morning seeped into the Frostwood like a held breath finally released, soft bands of pale gold filtering through heavy branches, turning last night's blizzard into a quilt of untouched snow. It was the kind of dawn that did not demand to be seen, only felt. Mira stood at the center of the glade, as the wolves held their silent crown around her. The night had stripped away everything that did not belong, leaving behind a stillness that was not emptiness but fullness, a presence that pressed gently at the edges of her awareness. The golden warmth beneath her skin pulsed faintly now, no longer a shock, no longer something she tried to hide. It felt like a memory she had always carried but only just learned how to hear. Arden remained on his knees. Snow crusted the hem of his cloak, and his breath came in shallow clouds, but he did not rise. He could not bring himself to stand above her again, not when the wolves had redrawn the shape of the world around her in a way he could not unsee. "I banished you at Moonrise," he said quietly. "I thought the pack needed to be free of doubt." Mira met his gaze, her expression neither hard nor soft, but honest in a way Frostreach had never taught her to be. "You thought silence was the same as weakness," she replied. The words did not cut. They clarified. The wolves did not move when Arden finally pushed himself to his feet. They did not bare their teeth or shift into challenge. They simply held their ground, a boundary made of breath and instinct that refused to be crossed. "I will walk with you back to the gates," Arden offered. It was the first thing he had said since the storm that did not sound like an order. Mira looked behind her at the wolves. 10 shapes met her gaze, steady, unyielding, not hostile but absolute. They were not leaving. She felt it in the way the forest leaned toward her, in the way the wind slid past her shoulders rather than against her chest. Whatever bond had been forged in the storm was not meant to be broken at sunrise. "I can't go back," she said. Not because she was afraid. Because she was done shrinking. The wolves closed ranks behind her with a soft, collective shift that made the meaning unmistakable. They would not let her go. Not back into a place that had only learned to measure worth by noise and force. Not back into halls that echoed with rules made by those who had forgotten how to listen. Arden bowed his head. Not as alpha. As witness. The forest did not erupt in triumph. It did not howl or roar. It simply resumed breathing, the world sliding into a new balance that did not need proclamation to exist. Mira took a step deeper into the Frostwood. The wolves flowed with her, a living tide reshaping itself around her path. She did not look back at Frostreach's distant towers, nor did she pretend they were nothing. They were her past, not her prison. When the pack woke later that morning, they would search for her. They would call her name. But the forest had already answered. And it was not giving her back.